I am sitting talking to you from a post-capitalist society, but unfortunately it's not a socialist or communist one. It's something even worse than capitalism. It's a techno-feudalist society.
Technofeudalism.
That's according to Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek Minister for Finance and the leader of the Democracy in Europe movement. Varoufakis has written many books about capitalism and he makes a lot of interesting observations, but I have quite a few problems with a lot of his theory, and his new book, Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism, is no exception. In short, I think we are still living in capitalism, and what he is describing is really just an intensification of the monopoly capitalism that Lenin described back at the start of the 20th century. To cut to the chase, the biggest problem that I see with this book is that he isn't describing a new mode of production. He's describing something that sits on top of the mode of production, or sits at atop of the mode of production, which is capitalism. So the point of production is a capitalistic one. The system is still based on commodity production, mass commodity production, private ownership of production, exploitation of waged labor, and the cloud capital and techno-feudalists that he talks about sit atop of that process. And of course, I wouldn't call them techno-feudalists, but ultra-parasitic capitalists, if you like. The other big problem I have with it is that, as my work has always emphasized, in the tradition of Karl Marx and Henrik Grossman, capitalism necessarily births socialism, a socially owned economy, or communism, a commonly owned economy, same difference. So this thesis of a techno-feudalist society, he's not arguing that capitalism has disappeared completely, but that it's no longer the dominant system. This basically leads him to a reformist view where we basically have to save capitalism from techno-feudalism with reforms that save democracy, liberal democracy as such. And that basically leaves no room for Marx's theory that capitalism necessarily kills itself and lays the foundation for socialism, that socialism becomes absolutely historically necessary through natural historical economic processes.
Now, what am I saying with technofeudalism? I'm saying that capital triumphed so magnificently that it mutated. It created a mutant version of it, which I call cloud capital. My hypothesis is that this new version of capital, cloud capital, is a very different beast from industrial robots and steam engines. And anyone who owns it owns effectively a new form of digital land. Think of Amazon.com. It's like a cloud thief. It's a thief that lives in the cloud, effectively on a bed of cloud capital, which allows the new lord to charge rents. Because Jeff Bezos doesn't produce anything that you buy on Amazon, same with the owners of Alibaba and so on. What they do, however, is they charge 40%. Think about it, 40% is a gigantic rent on the price of everything that is sold to you on Amazon.com. Now, this is not a theoretical point. My point, the point I'm trying to make in the book, is that this is a great transformation. Because if markets have been replaced by these digital thieves, digital fiefdoms, and profits have been replaced by rents, then that's not capitalism anymore.
Varoufakis says that rents have replaced or are replacing profits, but this is the problem with his whole thesis of trying to compare it to feudalism. In capitalism, rents come out of profits. They're siphoned out of profits. So the rents being made by techno-feudalist monopolies originate in commodity production through the exploitation of labor, whereas rents in feudalism, broadly speaking, worked differently in terms of surplus produce was given by the peasants to the lords in return for using the land. He claims that capitalism's defining mechanism, markets governed by profit-seeking competition, is no longer dominant. I don't think that markets are the biggest defining mechanism of capitalism. The biggest defining mechanism of capitalism is that it's based on commodity production, and at the heart of the commodity is its dual character, which is that it's a use value, a utility with a specific use, and it's a commodity containing exchange value, which essentially is derived from labor time, which is transformed into monetary value. This contradiction makes capitalist crisis and everything that follows inevitable, because the more use values you produce, the more exchange value per commodity withers away. So that's where absolutely all of my theory and my explanations for why what is happening in the world stems from. That is the core, essential foundation of everything that I write. And I think if you don't start with that starting point, because it is the starting point, you end up running into incorrect analyses and incorrect solutions for the crisis, presuming that it's in our interests to solve these crises that we unfortunately face in our time. So basically it says that under capitalism, firms competed in open markets, but under technofeudalism, platform owners control access rules, data, and rents, much like feudal lords controlled land. There's some truth to this. He makes loads of interesting points, and Yanis Varoufakis is a very astute analyst. But like, markets do still exist; they are still dominant, even within monopoly capitalism, where you get fewer and fewer companies dominating each industry. There's still competition, and in fact that competition intensifies because there's less profit being generated relative to total capital as this process of mass commodity production advances, and we produce things in less time with more automation, and therefore you get less exchange value and less profits per commodity. So competition actually intensifies. The overall size of the pie is getting bigger, and there's fewer capitalists competing for each slice. But because of the falling rate of profit, there's never a big enough slice for anyone. So everyone's fighting to take each other's slice, or at least part of it, all the time. They're still producing things to sell on a market as well. Consumers still have to buy their stuff on a market. So, but the thing with monopoly capitalism that Lenin observed and that Marx had actually written about quite a lot as well. Obviously, Lenin just had the benefit of another 50 years of insight, is that to offset the falling rate of profit, companies go bankrupt, which leaves fewer capitalists in relative terms to the whole population, partly because competition has to result in winners and losers, and partly because offsetting falling profitability necessitates mergers and acquisitions so that two or more firms combine into one and therefore corner a bigger portion of the market. But of course, private markets still exist. There's still the exchange of commodities, the exchange of capital on the market. That's still happening. That's still a dominant thing on the world economy today. The thing that's different, or that has changed to a greater degree, is the amount of control that the dominant monopolies have in terms of the portion of the market they own and command. That gives them more power in terms of having more lobbyists, more politicians in their pocket, etc., etc. And as a consequence, they have greater control over the state and over regulation. So Varoufakis argues that big tech platforms are now feudal domains rather than private capitalist enterprises. Talking obviously about Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple. He says this because they impose terms unilaterally. Yes, that is largely true. They extract revenues through rents, not competition. They control the digital space in which economic interactions occur. I couldn't get on board with that last point. Varoufakis stresses that when you enter Amazon's platform, you are not in a market, you are in Amazon's domain, where Amazon determines rankings, visibility, pricing pressures, and fees. The last point has a lot of truth to it, but it's a function of how capitalism has developed necessarily, because again, Amazon's growth has led it to dominating e-commerce, and therefore it gets to set its own terms to a large extent, but it's still providing for a market, for a socialized market, as the consumer side of things is socialized because you're producing for a wide-ranging social consumer base. And yes, these companies depend more and more on rent rather than competition. Just on the point of competition, he kind of says that revenues are in capitalism are extracted through competition. Yes, obviously, the more successful you are in outcompeting a rival, the more profit you accrue. That's part of the process, but profit is accrued ultimately or essentially through the exploitation of labor, through the theft of the worker's labor time. All of the time that the worker works is essentially absorbed by the machines they use, passed into the commodities they produce, and then part of that time transformed into value is paid back to the worker in wages, but most of it is kept by the capitalist for their own consumption, for reinvestment in capital expansion, to pay company bills and other expenses, and so on. Rent, although it was obviously much more dominant in feudalism, has always been a feature of capitalism. For starters, if a capitalist has to rent land upon which they operate a factory, they have to pay rent to the landlord, which comes out of the profit, which reduces the profit rate. So as capitalism has advanced, there has been a struggle that has tended to result in the capitalist owning more of the land that they use in order to reduce the proportion of profits that they have to spend on rent. But rent has always also been a intensifying feature of monopoly capitalism. The more industries are dominated by fewer companies, the more monopoly rents become a feature, and obviously they become more and more dependent on rents because of falling profitability. So they, instead of producing new value at the source of production, again, which is still capitalist, the source of value is the exploitation of labor at the point of production of commodity production in terms of exchange value. Because that source of value is diminishing with every expansion of commodity production, with every innovation that speeds up production and therefore devalues capital, the capitalist is becoming more and more dependent on rent seeking to offset that process, which means at source we don't have a problem of redistribution but of creation. The problems of how we are distributing value stem from the lack of value creation. So Henrik Grossman wrote a lot about monopoly rents, and I'm just going to, forgive me for reading out, but I just want to make sure I remember it all. So monopoly rents depend on differential conditions of production. They arise when a capitalist controls a resource, technique, or location that enables them to produce at lower individual costs or under special conditions unavailable to others. Examples include exclusive access to natural resources, patents and proprietary methods in terms of exclusive ownership, superior technology, and advantageous locations. This differential advantage allows monopolists to sell above the average cost while still being able to compete on price. Monopoly rents come from redistribution of surplus value, not its creation, as I already explained, which means there's a transfer of surplus value from other capitalists who are potentially more productive per commodity in terms of the value they're creating. This compresses the profits of non-monopolistic firms or indeed monopolistic firms who are losing out to a greater competitor, and therefore increases the rate of profit for monopolies because these techno-feudalist firms still invest depending on the rate of profit that they are reaping, because they still need to attract capital investment. They are still capitalist private enterprises. This obviously deepens the crisis of capitalism for the firms that are losing out and concentrates capital into fewer and fewer hands. This is the natural process of capitalism and capital accumulation. Grossman stressed, as I said at the start of the video, that this does not abolish competition, but just creates bigger monopolistic blocks that compete across national borders on the global economy. Lastly, monopoly rents help to mask but do not negate the falling rate of profit. Because monopolies can maintain prices above their own production costs, they can temporarily secure higher profit rates than the system's average. Grossman notes that this can create the illusion that capitalism is stabilizing, conceal systemic profitability issues, and allow dominant firms to expand despite declining system-wide profitability. Back to Varoufakis, he argues that data is the new serf-produced surplus. So a lot of us are no longer workers, we are serfs once again.
Interestingly, when I was researching this book, I discovered that on average, conglomerates of the old capitalist type pay about 80 to 85% of their revenues to workers. Facebook pays 1%. Why? Because Facebook, the capital of Facebook, is produced for free by everybody who creates their own pages, posts messages, and sends reviews to one another, and so on.
This mirrors feudalism, in which peasants produced surplus for their lords simply by living on the land. Ultimately, though, this isn't a return to serfdom, it's intensification of wage slavery, of proletarianization, because essentially you're producing more value in less time, or more specifically, you're creating more surplus value than you were before, because you're receiving less in compensation for your work, because what you produce for Twitter and YouTube and Facebook is produced for free without a wage. So when you add that on to the other work you do and aggregate it, there's a greater proportion of surplus value being produced that is then transformed into profit and capital.
The fact remains, they put a lot of work. They don't think of it as work. But it is work. And it is work that is replenishing the capital stock of TikTok. Now, that from a macro perspective is crucial, because you have capital being reproduced without wage labor. Now, why is it important? Because wage labor means that there are wages that are being paid, and those wages contribute to the demand for things in the marketplace. When you have all this labor producing capital, but it is not remunerated, that shrinks aggregate demand macroeconomically. And what does that mean? It means that central banks cannot get away without printing more money to replenish the demand. But then, especially when you have an inflationary cost of living crisis as we do now, there is a clash of objectives. On the one hand, to arrest rising prices, but on the other hand, if you don't print the money, because you have so much work that is not remunerated, then aggregate demand is shrinking. This is why central bankers are in a state of apoplexy. They do not know what to do. They are damned if they do, raise interest rates, and they're damned if they don't.
Varoufakis says that falling wages are responsible for capitalist crisis. This underconsumption theory is a running theme in all of his work on capitalism, but actually falling wages help revive capitalist profitability, because it reduces the outlay on production and therefore re-widens profit margins. If a capitalist can produce more commodities with a lower outlay, they're going to attract more investment and their company can grow. And all of these companies still operate like that. And in fact, they're, of course, monetizing data, commodifying data, which means they're effectively turning the consumer labor of their consumers into commodities.
You have this gigantic disconnect between the amount of money in the economy. We never had so much money as we have now, globally speaking, across the West or the whole world. And yet investment is at the lowest level in proportion to how much money there is in the economy. And I do believe the answer lies in this fantastic transformation, very violent transformation of a world from capitalism to something that I call technofeudalism, which is, of course, based on enormous quantities of capital, unlike the older version of feudalism.
Varoufakis says that this record low investment is caused by this great transformation into technofeudalism, but investment always tends to fall in relative terms as capitalist crisis arises, and this was identified by Marx and Grossman. They identified that this tended to worsen with each crisis because you end up with more surplus capital, or what they called overaccumulated capital, that can't be reinvested profitably, can't be reinvested in production profitably. So it goes into speculation on the stock market or in US money market funds or gold or Bitcoin, for example, these days, where it can accrue interest. But again, it's siphoning proceeds from profits from value that's created elsewhere. Money market funds in the US have risen sharply before every recent recession and then fallen during and after the recession as a devaluation process unfolds via the recession. He says that platform power undermines markets and democracy, creating dependency among states and corporations and accelerating inequality. Governments, he says, become increasingly reliant on big tech infrastructure for communication, security, AI, logistics, and public administration, because obviously they own all of the technology and resources that governments need to use. But the problem with that framing is that I think it's really the other way around. Capitalists are increasingly dependent on the government because of falling profitability. They're increasingly parasitic. They're therefore increasingly dependent on bleeding the public dry through the tax system. So capitalists and capitalist corporations increasingly fused with the state, or they increasingly control the state, and they're increasingly dependent on making the state its biggest customer, which then warps the type of business models that they go with. This increasing dependence on the state, though, ultimately leads to the situation historically whereby capitalism has to turn into socialism because the tax base, the public purse, is not a bottomless reservoir of value that the capitalist class and capital accumulation can live off forever. It's bleeding it dry, and therefore that is leading to the historical point in time where this fusing of the state and capital basically expresses itself as a final merger, as I call it, in terms of this historical accelerating process of mergers and acquisitions leading to a final merger. And I think this fusion between the state and capital is representative of that. And because the tax base will basically run dry, there's no option left but for the state to turn the tables and take ownership of the economy, because capital just won't be able to afford to own it anymore. So my solution is crystal clear. It's socialism. It's the social ownership of production and the economy at large. And this is where we have probably the biggest disagreement because Varoufakis' solution is ultimately reformist. He's kind of trying to save capitalism or revert back to capitalism, whereas I see all of these problems as symptomatic of the natural historical process of capital accumulation, whereby it reaches a crescendo and a ceiling whereby we can't progress without a new mode of production, a socialist mode of production, a commonly owned mode of production and economy. So he argues that we must reclaim control over cloud capital by democratizing it and turning it into a digital commons. I have no issue with that. He believes the solution is not to break up these companies, which would merely recreate smaller monopolies, but to transform ownership models So he wants platforms to become public utilities or cooperatives. I'm not totally against worker-owned cooperatives. I do think they will play a role in the transition, but they're not sustainable because they're privately owned. And again, they will experience the same problem as capitalism in terms of becoming more productive and therefore experiencing a falling rate of profit. In terms of public utilities, we're in agreement. We're in agreement that algorithms should be regulated and auditable, and that data harvesting must be transparent. Data should become a public resource. Again, no disagreement from me. This doesn't mean that everyone's personal data should be shared. He argues for a public data trust, a legal entity that stores data under citizen control, not corporate control. That's all fine. Users should be able to move between platforms the way they move between email providers. Platforms should not be walled gardens. They should function like communication networks. Absolutely. Like one of the first things we should do when we start transitioning to socialism is make the internet completely free, which would, of course, boost productivity massively because you'd no longer have people going, well, I can't afford to use this app. I can't afford to use this new hyper-productive AI tool because it's just too blimmin' expensive. Varoufakis also proposes sovereign digital self-ownership, which I again agree with. Personal digital rights. Data created by individuals is theirs, not the platforms. Citizens can authorize or forbid usage. Platforms must request access and compensate appropriately. I'm fine with this, apart from obviously if you are working for a social or state enterprise, the data you produce for that will be owned by the social enterprise and social enterprises at large, because obviously social enterprises will be allocating resources between and within each other. He proposes a universal digital dividend in the form of a guaranteed minimum income. He says public services should be funded by digital rents. Again, I'm not opposed to that, absolutely, but it's just not sustainable because you're just extracting wealth. You're taking wealth away from capitalists and giving it to the public, which deepens the crisis of capitalism, which then makes the capitalist class more aggressive and the class struggle intensifies, which is, to be expected. But you can't just stop at, a wealth tax on digital rents, because that's either going to get rolled back so that capital remains profitable and viable, or you have to go all the way and expropriate capital and implement socialism. So he ultimately proposes a democratic cloud commonwealth, a digital social economy that is neither fully capitalist nor traditionally socialist. Social democracy, methinks, which is still capitalism. And the problem with social democracy is, one of the biggest problems with social democracy is, again, it's unsustainable. For the reasons I've just gone over, I won't go over them again. He says markets can exist, but platforms cannot control access to them. I mean, that's just pie in the sky thinking. Ultimately, he wants the state to be more of a regulator of digital markets than an owner. So, I mean, that kind of sounds like he does want to break up monopolies and have smaller companies, because he's kind of proposing, the worker cooperatives take over the internet. Again, worker cooperatives, I don't hate them or anything, but they're not sustainable. They're still privately owned. Ultimately, we're moving towards a system where robots and computers are doing the vast majority of the work. They can't be exploited for profit, which private companies, even if they're worker cooperatives with equally distributed income for each worker in the company with no hierarchy or whatever, that is just not going to work in the long run. It might work for a while, but as we move towards a system of fully automated production, which is coming because humans innovate regardless of the economic system, but also because capital accumulation depends on innovation, because when there's falling profitability, you have to make more commodities in less time to offset that tendency, only to intensify it So the solution is not this proposed half-baked compromise between an immovable object and an irresistible force. We have to go beyond that. A fully automated system of production can't be capitalist because there's no profit extracted, there's no value created, no exchange value created, and there's no one with any money because no one's being paid a wage to buy the commodities that capitalists need to sell in order to realize the profit that was created by workers in terms of the theft of their labor time. So, yeah, I mean, interesting work for sure. Lots of good observations about the way things are working and developing. But this concept of technofeudalism ultimately obscures the way capitalism is necessarily developing, and it obscures the ultimate solution, which again is historically necessary, which is to have a fully socially owned economy, a world socialist or communist economic system, because basically as I've said, we're working towards this final merger to offset falling profitability. You get more and more mergers and acquisitions at an accelerated rate. You actually get more planning within capitalist enterprises for efficiency gains, again, to try and get profits up again. So the system's becoming more and more planned, which means we're working towards a system that needs to be planned as a whole without competition, a singular system. So the point I want to make is that ultimately these techno-feudalists, these ultra-parasitic capitalists, cannot depend on the system as it exists ad infinitum because it's just unsustainable. And basically not enough exchange value is being produced. And so between now, basically late stage capitalism, and the beginning of socialism, the capitalist system will break down. It won't just seamlessly transition. The profit rates will be too low for production to continue on the same level, and capitalists will therefore cut production massively. This will obviously manifest in a massive political struggle within the capitalist class and between the capitalist class and the working class. And the working class will grow even larger because more people will be expelled from the capitalist class. And yeah, so they're not these the Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses of the world, they're not techno-feudalists, they're ultra-parasitic capitalists. And they are unwittingly producing a new economic technical basis. And this is the point I think Varoufakis obscures the most. By building a fully automated system of production, they are producing a new economic technical basis which has to be socialist. It has to be socially owned because it's just not going to create surplus value and exchange value anymore. I hope that all makes sense. Ask any questions in the comments. I'll try to get back to you. If you like the video and would like to see more, please like and subscribe and leave a donation. Thank you. See you next time.